Hello, YouTube family. This is Alex here from Banganta House German Shepherds. I hope you're doing well. We're in the Northeast here. It's very cold, and I hope you are keeping your family warm and safe in this cold weather we're having. Happy February. Today's topic will be uh, outbreeding, outcrossing, and the ancestry loss coefficient. Why some breeds can't be saved at all through outcrossing. And you may find that an unusual topic from a person who has a lot of videos on line breeding and inbreeding and outcrossing. We're going to talk about breed management, how to create a healthy gene population for a breed, and what we can and can't do in some breeds. Before I begin, I want to explain that the goal of this channel is not to be a German Shepherd only channel because, as you notice, we don't discuss German Shepherds exclusively. We discuss other breeds. And one of the other goals of this channel, as part of the breeding community, is to advocate for our pure breed dogs. I feel that our heritage breeds are very important to preserve, very important to maintain, and we want the ethical treatment of animals, and we are advocates of animal welfare. We want our pure breeds to continue, and where possible, to make improvements within the breed. And we're not suggesting hybridizing our breeds as a solution to our problems. I want to get that right off the bat. So if you notice the videos on our channel, we are focused primarily on ethical breeding, uh, keeping the coefficient of inbreeding in check, checking genetic results through Embark or Wisdom Panel or GenSol or whatever tool you have as your preference, doing OFA hip x-rays and so forth. Now, let's talk about uh, a very important topic, which is outcrossing. Let's define outcrossing versus outbreeding versus the AVK, the Ancestry Loss Coefficient. Let's talk about that for a minute. In any line breeding program, you're going to hit a genetic bottleneck where unless you outcross, you're going to have deleterious traits pile up despite you are doing your darndest to prevent breeding a carrier to a carrier. You're going to still have a possibility of genetic defects despite avoiding breeding a carrier to another carrier. And so when you have a gene pool of a certain breed, when you're outcrossing, what are you doing? Well, what you're doing is you're taking a dominant gene, which is masking a recessive gene. A dominant masks a recessive. And as a consequence, that gene is coming from a dog which also is a carrier, but whose dominant masks the recessive in your line, and you've temporarily restored hybrid vigor. What is hybrid vigor? Hybrid vigor is a dog which is very healthy, has good lung and heart capacity, has good running ability, has high fertility, long lifespan, free of disease, and is very healthy in its life. So breeding free of disease is a key component of hybrid vigor. Can you maintain hybrid vigor in a line breeding program? Of course. If dogs are not very closely related, such as 5-5, third cousins, 4-4, second cousins, those dogs only have 1/256th of the total genes in common. So we are maintaining genetic diversity despite having common ancestors. That brings up an important topic. What is COI, coefficient of inbreeding, and how do you use that as a tool? And then we're going to bring up what is AVK, the ancestry loss coefficient. How do you use that as a tool? And when is outbreeding, which is breeding not within the breed to an outcross, but going to an outside breed and opening the gene pool relevant? If is it relevant in a pure breed dog to outcross, outbreed to a completely unrelated breed? Would that is that ever appropriate? How can you maintain a clean gene pool of a closed stud book if you will outbreed, right? I mean, that doesn't seem possible or correct, right? I mean, if you're advocating for pure breed dogs, you're advocating for a closed stud book with no other breeds allowed to mix in, right? That's what a breed is. It's pure because every member of your gene population is pure, correct? Well, let's talk about three measures of the coefficient of inbreeding. The coefficient of inbreeding was first devised by civil right in 1922 as a measure of the inherited or relatedness or consanguinity of uh, members of the same uh, dogs in your breed on your yard. Now, the Wright's equation is the classic equation, but it assumes there's no limit to the depth of the pedigree. You could be 10 generations deep, 20 generations deep, and there's no mathematical limit. You can go back as far back as to the beginning of the breed. And of course, in any breed, all dogs in that breed are obviously related. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the same breed. Just like in horses, if you go back to the thoroughbred, well, there were three Arabian stallions and two um, mares of a different breed, the Morgan, I believe. And those three Arabian stallions and those few Morgan horses went on to form the basis of the thoroughbred. So every thoroughbred in the world is a third cousin or a fourth cousin or a fifth cousin of every other thoroughbred in the world. Just like every German Shepherd is some kind of a relative of some other German Shepherd, because it goes back to the initial foundation of the breed itself. When a breed is first created, you have to inbreed heavily in order to cement type. And then as the gene pool grows, your need for inbreeding and line breeding decreases. But within a breed, you have different gene pools. For example, if I'm breeding a German Shepherd and I'm breeding it for herding sheep, I want dogs which have an affinity for sheep. And I'll have a sub gene pool within the breed at large for that task. Or if I'm breeding police dogs and for bite sports, I'll have a sub gene pool within the gene pool at large. If I'm breeding dogs to walk the blind, which is a work for the dog, then that gene pool is again a sub gene pool within the breed. Now, when you're dealing with a sub gene pool within the breed as a whole, let's say the breed as a whole has a 12% coefficient of inbreeding as measured by embark. But your sub gene pool of, let's say, protection dogs has a 30% COI, even though the two dogs themselves may not be very closely related. That's because of the founding sire effect. Certain dogs are foundation dogs of a certain country, let's say Germany, where those dogs were used over and over and over to form a sub-gene pool of dogs good for Schutzhund in the case of the German Shepherd. So, as measured by embark, you may have a 30% COI, but the dogs may be only be seen as third cousins. So, according to Hardyman's equation, well, those dogs are not very related because it measures relatedness within the family. But it assumes you're starting off with zero relatedness. In other words, there's no relationship at all. But in reality, that's not true. They're part of the same breed, so therefore they are related, even if not closely, they're related in the past. And depending how closely they're related, the higher your COI and the higher your risk. Now, so what is the difference? Well, there are three measurements of coefficient of inbreeding. There's the Wright's equation, Hardyman's equation, and embark equation or result. The most accurate one is the one from embark because it actually measures the allele pairs, which are homogeneous runs of called ROH, runs of homogeneity within the dog you're measuring. So no matter what the Hardyman equation predicts, The embark value is the actual value, whereas the Hardiman value is only the predicted value. Also, you must understand that a puppy in your litter will not have the identical coefficient of inbreeding as its litter mate. One litter mate may have only a 12% coefficient of inbreeding, and another litter mate may have a 30% coefficient of inbreeding. You say, well, how could that be? They have the same two parents. Well, each puppy is only 50% related to each other because they're siblings. Siblings are only 50% related to each other. They're not clones. If they were identical clones, they would be 100% related to each other. Now, in sibling A, puppy number one, he got, of the total homogeneous genes which are possible, which is the coefficient of relatedness, out of that total, rather than getting a quarter of that total, he got 40% of that possible total. But his litter mate got 12% of that total. In other words, if the coefficient of relationship is, let's say, 37%, one puppy got 9.25%, which is about a quarter of 37%. One puppy got 12.25%, and one puppy got 17% out of the total 37%. In other words, the homogeneous gene pairs between mother and father lined up more copies of the total possible genes lined up in puppy 1 versus puppy 2 than in puppy 3 and puppy 4. In other words, it's a predicted value, and that value is not equal. It's spread across the entire litter. So the only way to get an accurate number would be to do an embark on the parent dogs, and then let's say they were carriers of a specific disease. Now you were careful to avoid breeding a carrier to a carrier. Now you want to know what puppy you want to keep out of that entire litter. Let's say you want to keep a female. Well, you would do, let's say, Gensol to test all the females because you're only, let's say, interested in the females. And you want to keep the one which is a clear. So let's say your dog is a DM carrier. Its partner dog, let's say the female is a DM carrier, the male is a clear. It would be irresponsible to obviously breed a carrier to a carrier. I'm sure you understand that, right? So you bred a carrier to a clear. Now, to clean up your population on your yard, you only want to keep the clears, not the carriers, not to perpetuate more carriers. So now, how do you do that? Well, what's a cost-effective way of doing it? Let's say it costs you $135 to test each parent using Embark. But it only costs you $35 to use Gensol, Gensol, because they test by the gene in question that you care about, not 253 genes. In this case, you would pay for testing of DM only, let's say. So that's how you can save money. If you have 9 puppies at $35 a puppy, you'll pay about $300 to test the entire litter versus paying $135 per puppy times 9 to test the entire litter. So it becomes cost prohibitive to test the entire litter with Embark at 100. I think they give you a break after the first test at 135. I think it's 109 if memory serve. And by the way, I have no relationship with these companies, so I'm not making any profit in discussing all these things. But let's say it costs you $109 per puppy to use Embark. Well, that's too expensive because you already spend that on the parents, right? Now you only care about the particular carrier gene that was identified through Embark. Well, now you're going to test every puppy. Well, you're going to use Gensol now only for that one attribute versus the entire spectrum of what you could test for. Let's say you're breeding collies and you care about the MDR1 gene, which is resistance to disease. Well, instead of testing 253 possible genes, now you don't care about 253, which is when you tested the parents. Now you care about only MDR1. Which ones are clear of MDR1? Let's say that's your goal. You would then use Gensol at $35 a copy to test every puppy, and not $135 per puppy times, let's say, 9 or 10 puppies. In other words, you use the more broad test on the parents and the more narrow test on the puppies in order to zero in at a lower cost the carriers of a specific gene in your puppy, so that if you want to know, let's say you're only keeping females and you're going to sell all the males. I only keep females. I don't keep males usually. So I wanted to know which female to keep. If all things are equal, let's say their working ability is equal, their prey drive is equal, their recoverability is equal, then if every way is equal, then of course, if the temperament is equal, then of course the best next test you want is therefore, well, which one is the cleanest in terms of genetics? And that's where you would use GenSol as a second backup to your embark test that you did on the parent dogs. That's a cost-effective way at $35 a puppy to figure out which puppies are clear, which puppies are carriers. Now, what if we have a clean puppy, which is a non-carrier, but doesn't have good working ability? In other words, if you're breeding for a completely clean genetic copy, but it's terrible in terms of conformation or working ability, do you keep the carrier because that's the one with the working ability, or do you keep the clear, but it has poor working ability or poor recoverability? Well, that's a judgment call that you need to make as a breeder based on your goals. I'm not going to tell you what you should do, but if you're going to breed, if you're going to line breed, keep the one with lower working ability but clean. If you're performance breeding, but you're not line breeding that dog as part of your gene pool, then keep the one with the better working ability, but then you can't line breed off of it because you'll keep repeating the same gene problems and you're going to lock them in. So in other words, it depends on your goal. Are you breeding for performance, where greater performance matters than the cleanest possible pedigree? Or are you going to line breed and you want to only keep the cleanest copies of the genetics where that matters more to you? Again, it's a judgment call. It's something you as the breeder have to decide. And obviously this video is aimed at breeders, but normal pet people can obviously watch and learn from this video as well. So with all that being said, genetic testing still does not prevent genetic defects, despite your best efforts to not pair a carrier with a carrier. It can reduce the odds, but number one, we don't have a genetic test for every disease, such as cancer or epilepsy, and we don't know everything about everything. So we can only test for what we can test for, and we can't test for everything. So you have to use COI as a decision point of what is a reasonable coefficient of inbreeding and what is a non-reasonable coefficient of inbreeding. Now, using the Hardiman, again, when you're speaking of numbers, you have to always say what scale are you using. Are you referring to embark or are you referring to a calculation? I want to speak in calculation terms, not in actual embark terms, because those are never going to be predictable, because unless you test the dogs, you don't know the values. So we're going to speak strictly from a pedigree point of view. If you know the pedigrees of your dogs and you're above 12.5% COI, you need to probably outcross. If you're at 25 or 30% COI, pedigree-based COI, not embark COI, you definitely have to outcross. You're going to definitely be on the verge of disease. So you have to make a decision of, well, my COI is 5%. Am I safe? Yeah, you're pretty safe. So anything below 6.25 is fairly safe. But again, you can develop a line with very low COI. So you develop a line and then you outcross to reduce genetic risk and you widen your line. Now, can you eliminate all risk? No. The question is then why create a line at all if you're safe doing outcrossing? Well, in order to be able to do an outcross, there have to be lines you can outcross to. In other words, one is a polar opposite of the other. In other words, if there were no lines, there would be nothing to outcross to. Now all you're doing is random matings. That's not outcrossing. That's just randomness. And you may not avoid the disease anyhow, strictly because of randomness that doesn't necessarily guarantee anything. And you have no traits that you can guarantee at all. And the moment you do one outcross, you've lost some of the work you accomplished in line breeding, because every time you outcross, you cut in half what you've accomplished. But you must, in order to keep a healthy gene pool. in your yard and in the breed as a whole. So that brings up an important point, which is how, as breeders, we can maintain healthy gene populations in our breeds. Well, we need to look at and again, this is not German Shepherd specific. We're talking about all breeds in this video, not German Shepherd specific. I want to make that clear. A good example that I can point to is the Dalmatian. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to share a couple of slides. The Dalmatian developed a disease of the kidneys because early on in the breed history, whoever was developing spots in the Dalmatian caused it to have a disease. I'm looking up the name, just bear with me that I can pronounce the name properly. Let me share my screen momentarily and we can elaborate on that. 1 second. Bear with me as we share. The disease is called hyperuricosuria, HUU. Again, hyperuricosuria. Now, let me share a screen regarding what happened with this disease, and we'll go from there. 1 second, please. I'm assuming you can now see this screen. So, the American Kennel Club in 1973, I'm hoping you can see what it says. The article was written by Denise Powell, and this is the link above. And I'm going to put the links to all these articles in the description so you can read them for yourselves. In 1973, the AKC put out a word that it wanted all Dalmatians checked who did not have this disease. In other words, can you, I want to make sure I can show the screen properly. Okay. So the word was put out that any Dalmatian, any, in the world that does not have I'm going to just say the acronym, HU. That's all. I'm going to just say HU. Hyperuricosuriasia. HU, I'm going to call it, okay? Any Dalmatian in the world, if you don't have this disease, let us know. And they could not find a single Dalmatian without this disease, not even one. So they decided to outbreed. By outbreed, meaning not outcross, because when every dog in your breed has the disease, there is nothing to outbreed to anymore. In other words, you can only outcross if some sub-gene pool does not have the disease. But once nothing has the disease, everything has the disease, then there is nothing to outcross to. In other words, you boxed yourself into a corner. So what they did was they outbred, not outcross. By outbred, I mean bred to a different breed, not outcross within the breed. So outcrossing is within the breed. Outbreeding is breeding outside the breed. They outbred to the pointer, which is where the Dalmatian comes from in the first place. And so they then took the result of that. I'm going to share that. I hope you can see this screen. This is the mode of inheritance. So if it's N, it's normal. HU. So you can have dogs where every dog you breed will have kidney disease and kidney stones, right? It affects the quality of the dog's life. So by outbreeding in around 1980, about 30 some years ago, almost 40 years ago, to the pointer, and then breeding that back to the Dalmatian, they solved this problem. Now, they had special permission from the AKC to register those dogs after 5 generations as Dalmatians. Now remember, if I do a 50-50 cross, pointer and Dalmatian, that F1 cross is 50-50. The next time, it's 75% Dalmatian, 25% pointer. The next time, it's 87.5% Dalmatian, 12.5% pointer. The next time, it's 93% Dalmatian. In other words, after 5 generations, they're essentially all pure Dalmatians. Well, they allowed this uh, cross of pointer and Dalmatian after 5 generations to be registered in the stud book as Dalmatians. Well, around 2000, let me make sure I got my facts straight. The crossbred of the pointer with the um, pointer was then disallowed. So even though it was 15 generations later, not 5, 15, and they originally agreed to only 5, all of a sudden, this was disallowed. Now, how could that be? They originally allowed it, right? So the work from the 1970s all the way until about 2005, all of a sudden they unregistered those dogs as pure Dalmatians. All of a sudden, now those dogs couldn't be bred to, those which had a clean copy of the gene. Well, the disease became again very prevalent in the remaining gene population of Dalmatians. They then re-allowed those dogs back into the breed, the ones which were from the original pointer cross in the late 1970s, and the reduction of the disease came back to being healthier in the gene pool. So here's another screen. I hope you can see it from the National Library of Medicine, and this is written by some professors here. Again, all of these will be cited in the description. So the hypereucosuria DNA sequence was identified in sequence because nowadays we can do genetic sequencing. Back then in the 1970s, we couldn't. And the only way to fix the breed was to outbreed to the pointer. So they then re-allowed those outbred dogs back into the registration of the AKC, and the breed became healthy again. So when you box yourself into a corner, you basically can't go any further. Let me stop sharing this screen. And so that brings up an important word in German. I hope I can pronounce it. Let me see if I can pronounce it properly. Just one second. I'm going to look up the pronunciation. It's AhnenVerlust-Koeffizient. It's called the Ancestor Loss Coefficient. Now, the AVK, I'm going to just call it the AVK, the Ancestry Loss Coefficient, tells you how healthy your breed still is. In other words, you can have a low COI, let's say 5%, but an AVK below 65%, and you're still going to be at some point boxed in where you'll have to outbreed, just like happened with the Dalmatian. So keeping COI low is not actually the solution, because even if you keep COI low, but the prevalence of disease in your breed is still very high because the AVK is low, you're going to reach the point of a bottleneck where there is no more clean copies. Everybody's a carrier. In other words, there's nothing else to outcross to. Nothing is left to outcross to. That's where understanding the AVK matters. Let me share my screen. I'm going to explain the AVK, and I'm going to explain how the AVK and the COI are kind of opposites of each other. So in simple terms, the COI is the degree of relatedness of the dogs. The AVK is the degree of unrelatedness of the dogs in the gene pool population as a whole, not in your yard. Now you say, well, why do I care about the gene pool of the population as a whole? Well, when your AVK shrinks and you outcross to some other breeder's dogs, hoping to get rid of a carrier to a carrier, you want to breed a carrier to a clear. Well, there are no more clears. Everybody's a carrier. This is now happening with the Doberman Pinscher. Nearly 85%, 75 to 85% of Doberman Pinschers have von Willebrand's disease. And there's almost nothing to outcross to, whether you go to Germany or the US or France, you're going to a whole different gene pool by going to a whole different country, right? So you would think, well, if I'm going to a different country, those dogs are not even closely related to my dogs because they're in a different geographical location, so they can possibly be the same gene pool. But when the AVK shrinks, it doesn't matter what country you go to. It doesn't matter where you import from. There are no more clears to be had. There's nothing left to be had. In other words, we're not quite at that point yet with the Doberman, but we're very close to it. So let me explain the AVK because I think it's worth explaining it, and then we're going to go on using the AVK as a counterbalance to the COI. Let me explain what I mean by that. Because once you're, let me share my screen again, and we're going to go again, okay? I hope everybody can see the PowerPoint I've made. So what is the AVK? The AVK measures how many unique ancestors actually exist in the pedigree. It reflects the width of the gene pool, not just how closely related the parents are. High AVK means many genetic options still exist. Low AVK means most genetic options are already lost. In other words, when your AVK shrinks to 65%, you're at the point where pretty soon you're not going to have any clears. Everybody will be a carrier. Once you're below 65%, let me show you how the math works. So here's the equation. The AVK is the number of unique ancestors divided by the number of total possible ancestors multiplied by 100. So it's a simple fraction. So let's say we're, as an example, let's say we're 10 generations in, and 10 generations of dogs, I'm going to have 1,024 ancestors, right? Now, if I have 1,024 ancestors and my gene pool is broad, they're going to be 1,024 unique ancestors. They're not going to be related. They're going to be completely unrelated dogs, right? Because you have a very broad gene pool. But all of a sudden, I find my ABK to be 20%. That means 200 out of 1,024, which is about 10%, are the same dogs. And let's say I have 196 dogs, which are repeated in the pedigree out of 1,024. Instead of my pedigree being really 1,024, it's really these 196 dogs that are my common ancestors, despite the fact that it should be 1,024. These 196 dogs made up my gene pool, not 1,024. You get it? In other words, if you go back far enough in time, instead of having unique ancestors, you're going to find this dog is a cousin of that dog, and this dog is a sister of the aunt of that dog, and the same thing happens in people because up until we didn't have jet aircraft travel until the 20th century. So most people married somebody in their village, and the distance you could travel would be as far as you can travel by horseback, maybe by train, steam train. But steam trains didn't exist until the 19th century. In the 18th century, you didn't have steam trains. Now, of course, we had ships carrying people from England and Spain and France over to the US, and there was travel between countries. But for the most part, people married somebody in their local village. So if you go back far enough in time in a specific geographical location, everybody's related to everybody else because that subset of people was the initial starting point of your gene pool. And the same thing happens in dogs. Instead of having 1,024 ancestors, you have much fewer than that number. In other words, Let's say you're 4 generations back, all right? Well, if you're 4 generations back, every time it's double. In other words, you have 4 grandparents, 8 great grandparents, 16 great great grandparents, 32 great 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 grandparents, 64, and so forth. Every time it's double, right? So it's 8, 16, 32, 64, and so forth, right? Now, if you have true unrelatedness, the number is always double 1 generation further back. But in reality, you don't have true unrelatedness. You have the same foundation animals which are in that breed, not only the original foundation dogs which started the breed, but over time, related dogs in a specific gene pool are found over and over in the pedigree, no matter what dogs you pick. In other words, let's do an example. So the AVK only matters if you are able to. So the formula is simple. It's a fraction. Number of unique divided by the number of total. That's simple, right? I have 200 unique out of 1,000 total. 200 over 1,000, that's 0.2. 0.2 times 100, 20%. So my AVK is 20%. But when you have a pedigree where the males and females are on the top and bottom pedigree, and it's an easy formula, but it's a hard thing to count. So the way to count it is 2 to the power of n plus 1 minus 2. So n is the number of generations. So you can't say AVK without saying the depth of the pedigree. So in other words, AVK with respect to 5, that's how you speak. AVK with respect to 10, that's how you speak. Because when you're comparing AVK to AVK, you must be at the same pedigree depth. Otherwise, the number is meaningless. In other words, if I'm pumping a tire, I'm using pounds per square inch. That's my measuring unit, right? If I'm pumping tires using metric system, I'm not going to have pounds per square inch. I'm going to have liters per square centimeter. So my measuring stick must be understood as part of expressing a number. I must reference it to what I'm measuring against, okay? So you don't say AVK, you say AVK with respect to the pedigree depth, okay? So it's 2 to the power n plus 1 minus 2. So for example, if I'm 5 generations in, 2n is 5, 5 plus 1 is 6, so it's 2 to the 6th power minus 2. Well, that becomes 62 possible ancestors. So these are the ranges when you read, especially when you read German pedigrees and pedigree database, you will see the AVK number. Pedigreedatabase.com and the American pedigree system does not use AVK, but the German working dog database, workingdog.com, they use the AVK, the Ancestor Loss Coefficient. Now, how do you know where you are in the breed? Not in your yard, in the breed as a whole, right? That's how you figure out where your breed is at, how healthy it is. So let me give you the numbers. I researched this for the purpose of this video. If you have 85% or higher AVK, you have high genetic diversity. In other words, 85% of your value in the 5th generation are unique dogs, which means 15% are repeated dogs. It's out of 100. So if 85% is unique, therefore 15% is the same, which means they're related. 85% in the 5th generation are unrelated. You see what I'm saying? That's how you understand these percentages. When you're reaching 60 to 70%, a bottleneck is forming. When you're below 60%, you're at the point of genetic exhaustion. It means you're about to run out of clears to breed your carriers to. You're at the point where the breed has to be outbred very, very soon, or there will be nothing left without the disease. There will be nothing left. And then below 60%, you have to outbreed, not outcross, because there's nothing to outcross to. You must outbreed, like what happened with the Dalmatian. We're approaching these numbers with the collie in terms of MDR1. Some of them, you give them ivermectin, which is a common drug for killing parasites, and they die from a simple drug like ivermectin. Whereas a normal dog, you give them ivermectin to deworm them, and no problem. Ivermectin is very, very safe. All of a sudden, you give a collie which has the MDR1 gene, boom, the dog dies because it's resistant to drugs, any drugs. Now, if you have a high AVK, you have a chance to breed that collie to another collie which does not have MDR1, and you're still going to have a clear copy to breed to, and one copy does not cause the disease. But when there's no other copy without MDR1, because your AVK is below 60%, there's nothing to outcross to. There's nothing left to outcross to. In other words, everything is a carrier. Nothing in the breed is left, which is not a carrier. Do you understand how this AVK thing works? It tells you when you must outbreed. Not outcross, outbreed. There's nothing left to cross to within your breed. Now, so how do we create a graph of AVK against COI? Because where do we keep an eye on COI versus AVK, and how do the two graphs relate to each other? Because you saw a lot of my videos, I covered COI. I didn't cover AVK. Now this video, we're covering AVK. So how many genetic options exist in the population, and can a breed still have an acceptable COI, but the AVK collapses? In other words, that's the example I gave you earlier. You could have a collie, I'm using a collie as an example, with an MDR1, which only has a 3% COI. So, well, it doesn't seem like it's that inbred. It's very low COI. But the breed, let's say, I'm not saying that's the case right now, I would have to research it, but let's say the breed is at 60% AVK. Well, it means you're running out of options to inbreed, to line breed to, or outcross to. There's really nothing left. So that's where you can have a low COI and a high AVK. It doesn't matter you have a low COI because you have a high AVK. You see what I'm saying? So now, this graph shows the percentage of AVK from 0 to 100% on the y-axis and COI on the x-axis. Notice it's a linear relationship. So it's not in other words, it's not an inverse relationship of 1 over a, it's a 1 over x equation, not a 1 over x squared, which is an inverse parabola. It's a linear equation. So there's a relationship with high COI and low AVK, low COI and high AVK. So yes, having low COI gives you a better AVK, but that's not the only solution. So COI rises slowly, but AVK collapses quickly. By the time COI looks dangerous, the gene pool is already exhausting. Outcrossing fails when AVK collapses. Okay, so now, what are some examples of that? Let's look at the modern Doberman Pinscher. In the modern Doberman Pinscher, one Willebrand's disease is extremely common. It's in fact 75 to 85% of the breed. Now the AVK is at 70%. If you go back to the graph, we are approaching the point where there will be no clear soon. At 60% AVK, you're approaching the point where almost everybody you meet will be a carrier. In this breed, and I'm not a fan of hybridization, don't get me wrong, but in this breed, breeding to the Besserone would make sense. Let me show you what I mean. Bear with me. Okay, a lot of people are not familiar with the French Besserone because it's not a common breed in the US. It's a French breed. It actually is one of the breeds along with the Rottweiler, which was used to start the Doberman Pinscher. Let me share my screen again, because just because people may not be familiar with it, and I want to kind of share that. All right, can everybody see the picture of the Besserone? If you didn't know this was A Besseron, you would think this is a Doberman Pinscher. In fact, it's not a Doberman Pinscher, it's a Besseron. It looks like a Doberman Pinscher, but it's not. Now, this breed is similar in size and coloring and markings. In fact, it was it was one of the breeds tied to the creation of the Doberman Pinscher. Let's take a look at some other examples. I don't know if you can see my screen. So now here's an example. Now this is a 400-year-old breed. It kind of looks like a German Shepherd with Doberman markings. It's not a German Shepherd. And so the Besseron resembles the Doberman because it was one of the breeds used to start the Doberman. It's much older than Doberman. Doberman is about 120 years old, but the Besseron is 400 years old. So what I'm saying is that if the prevalence, let me stop sharing. If the prevalence of von Willebrand's disease gets to the point in the Doberman where there is nothing to outcross to, you must outbreed to some similar breed to clean it up. So just like the pointer was bred to the Dalmatian to clean up kidney disease, you probably will have to outbreed the Doberman soon to clean up the gene pool of the Doberman Pinscher. Now, you're going to breed back to the Doberman Pinscher. And I'm not recommending mixing these two breeds. I'm recommending a one-time outcross and then keep breeding back to the Doberman, testing the copies you're breeding are not carriers of von Willebrand's to clean up the gene pool, just like it was done in the 1970s with the Dalmatian. Now, the AKC or other bodies like the AKC, the UKC, the FCI would have to allow such an outcross to be registered once you've reached the 5th generation. And you would have to allow that cross to continue to be registered as a pure breed. Now, people will object. They're going to say, well, wait a second, it's not no longer pure. You've bred to another breed. Well, are you trying to keep the breed pure or are you trying to keep the breed healthy? When your AVK goes to the point below 60%, you have nothing to outcross to within your breed. You then must either accept disease or you must outbreed. Now, let's do another example, the British Bulldog. The British Bulldog is nothing like the Victorian Bulldog of the 19th century. Now let me share the screen. So this is, I'm going to present the screen again. Today's Johnson Bulldog and other types of modern Bulldogs. Now I'm not talking about pit bulls, I'm talking about bulldogs, actual bulldogs. Okay, this is a recreation of this channel is well known, Animal Watch. And I'm going to play it for a. So the modern English Bulldog can breathe. It's a brestophilic breed, but it has such a short snout that it can't get air into its airways. It's so passive, not because it's a passive dog, because it's sweet. It's very passive because it simply lacks capacity to function. And so the bottom line is that, let me stop sharing. When a breed reaches the point where the life of the dogs, it can't give birth to its own young except by C-section. It can't reproduce naturally except through AI. In other words, if human beings didn't intervene and make the dogs born by both C-section for the birth and by AI for reproduction, that breed is so unhealthy that if you have to intervene for it to be born or intervene for it to breed, that breed would go into extinction if nature was involved. So, in my opinion, we reached an AVK below 60% in that breed, and there's nothing to fix it. You would have to either outbreed, I didn't say outcross, I said outbreed to either the Dogo Argentino or the American Bulldog. the Johnson type, for example, to fix the breed. Now, are the bully types suitable to fix the British Bulldog? Yes, because they're descended from the Bulldog. But there's enough different DNA in them that that gene pool has to be re-expanded to reinvigorate it. In other words, the EVK tells you when the breed needs to be reinvigorated. That's what the point of the ancestry loss coefficient is. So you must understand the balancing act between COI and AVK. The COI is so high in that breed that no matter what dog you choose, it's so highly inbred that you can't fix the flaws in terms of hip dysplasia, breathing problems, breeding with a B-R-E-E. I'm just breathing, very similar words. You have to outbreed, like the Dogo Argentino might be a good outbreeding program. You have to restore the dog back to its original form to some degree. Now, some purists will say, well, I like the breed as it is. Well, what you like is a sick dog, one of the most sickest breeds we have. Um, Another example is the English Collie, Lassie. Uh, it has a lot of diseases, especially MDR1. You might want to cross it back with a Sheltie. Now, the Sheltie is an independent breed of the British Collie, but the British Collie was mixed with the original Shelties to form the Shelties, which looks like a miniature Collie, but it's not. Well, to fix the AVK value, you'll have to maybe outbreed it to a Sheltie and then cross it back with normal Collies. You have Collie blindness because the skull, to make the muzzle so long, the pressure on the back of the brain is where the vision center is. And our eyes are intermixed. In other words, the right eye is controlled by the left side of the brain, and the left eye is controlled by the right side of the brain. So we're crisscrossed in terms of our vision, and so are Collies. So when the back of the skull is compressed, that's the vision center of the brain in humans too. The eyes, where the vision is formed in the brain, is so compressed because to make that long snout, that a lot of Collies have Collie blindness now because of that extremely long muzzle. I don't have the solution for the Collie, but I think that we're reaching a point we have to probably outcross it to the Sheltie and then cross it back to the Collie. In other words, in our effort to create pure breeds and make them pure, the goal of pure means you're only breeding within your own breed, not to another breed. That's hybridization. That's a mongrel. I'm not saying we mongrelize our dogs. I'm not saying that. I'm in favor of our pure breeds. But what I am saying is we are reaching the point of very low AVK in some of our pure breeds. Once you hit that 60%, guys, you gotta outbreed because the breed will not survive unless you prevent the piling up of diseases. Now, people will give me a counter argument. You're gonna give me the counter argument would be as follows. Alex, you're introducing new diseases into your breed. Here's the argument. Let's say I'm making up a hypothetical for the hell of it, okay? Let's say I breed a pointer to a pit bull, just for the sake of conversation, okay? Now, the pointer has a bunch of diseases and the pit bull has a bunch of diseases. Now, aren't you introducing the diseases of the pointer into the pit bull, and aren't you introducing the diseases of the pit bull into the pointer? Yes, there are breed-specific diseases. That is true. So the diseases of the pointer are not the diseases of the pit bull. So they're going to be mixing diseases from this breed and this breed, but they're not the same diseases. So you have a breed which is not a carrier of the diseases of this breed, and this breed is not a carrier of the diseases of this breed. So in other words, each breed has breed-specific diseases, but they're not the same diseases in both breeds. You see what I'm saying? So in your F1 cross, you're going to increase your hybrid vigor, and then you're going to breed back to the other breed. Now, didn't you introduce the diseases of the other breed into your breed? No, not unless it meets another carrier. But you're only breeding back to the original breed. You're not crossing the two constantly. It's a one-time thing just to get rid of a specific disease. Now, if it's polygenetic and multiple traits are involved versus monogenetic, this is a much harder conversation to be had. Okay, well, if you don't want to outbreed once in a while to increase your ABK percentages to go up, then what's your other solution? Well, the other solution we have at our disposal is called CRISPR. CRISPR is a gene editing tool that we now can splice genes with, and we can inject RNA from another slice of DNA, and it's telling it how to this broken copy to behave based on this clean copy. So that's called gene editing and gene sequencing. Now, to do that, you need $50,000. And I'm not joking. You need $50,000 to do gene splicing and gene editing or to do cloning of an animal. I don't think most breeders are going to spend $50,000 to use CRISPR to gene edit out the bad gene. I think it's much easier just to outbreed and then back into your breed than to do a gene editing with something called CRISPR. I'm sure some of you follow genetic information, and I'm sure you've heard of that word, CRISPR, which is now a gene editing tool and a gene sequencing tool. So what I'm trying to get to you guys is that while you want to maintain a pure line and you want to performance breed your line and you want to have the best possible expression of the characteristics you desire, that's at the individual yard level. But at a breed level, we must keep an eye on the AVK number, not just the COI number. To repeat, the Dalmatian had the disease with the kidneys. The Doberman has the disease with von Willebrand's disease. Collies have MDR1 as well as collie blindness. So every breed has breed-specific diseases. We must, as breeders, look to keep our breeds, our heritage breeds, healthy. And that is why the ancestry loss coefficient is an important number to understand. I hope you found this useful. I hope you found it educational. Please click like and subscribe to our channel. And also, we have some sponsors. Please buy the products. It'll help us out. And we thank you for your time. Until the next one, have a good weekend.